Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Jean Cairns-Miller, who will discuss her book, Women from Another Planet, Our Lives in the Universe of Autism. Welcome to Rip Rap, Jean.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
This is a pretty unique book, really. I mean, and I enjoyed reading it, but I thought maybe a starting point would be to talk about the basis for how this book project emerged and how you and the others involved in it decided to do it.
One thing is we all met through email lists and we communicated quite a bit. And one of the things that we discovered or came to believe was that autistic disorders are probably underdiagnosed in women because women manifest autism different to men. And the same thing occurs with ADHD. The girl ADHD sits in her chair at school and doesn't cause any behavior problems. The boy is jumping all over the place. So the boys tend to be very visibly autistic, where the girls are sometimes just off in space. And we somehow wanted to look at that issue. And so a lot of what we were doing was making the knowledge of who we are. It was a knowledge-making activity. And we sort of wanted to beat the researchers to the punch on it. We wanted to somehow create the definition of that together. And so we started on a collaborative venture of an email discussion group. And we have a couple of chapters in there that have been put together by a doctor from New Zealand about our conversations. And you'll find that people will say, I find this such and such, and somebody else will say, oh, I don't see it that way at all. And so over time, we figured out what it was that we were and we weren't, and it doesn't come out in any nice package, but it's all there. The rest of the book is an anthology, and you'll see creative pieces and essays and whatever people chose to write, we looked at and tried to include things that we could. That was where it began. There was going to be a book. I was going to have a partner, but she bailed. So I ended up being it. Cheese stands alone. And so I kind of got it through, shepherded it through, and got it publishable, and basically did the editing and did a lot of the handiwork myself, but it came about because of some collaborative discussions that we had, and there are 4 contributing editors too who were involved in the project from the beginning and contributed different things to it. One of the defining moments in the book, though, was when we got sort of an offer to be published by one of probably the biggest autism publisher in the world, Jessica Kingsley, and I turned her down. And I turned her down because it struck me there, and the others as well, that what she wanted is what I call an Elephant Man book, and what some other autistic people say is a traveling zoo exhibit book. It exists basically to educate parents and professionals about autism, and no matter how fluent the books are and how gracious the authors are, it still ends up being about autism and not about whole lives. And that was a time when it seemed to me, and everyone else kind of agreed, that we were doing a book that was about us and how our lives are in the world, and that varied the audience a good bit from the narrow audience of parents and professionals.
Well, that's what the book seemed like. It was not only a series of conversations and exchanges, but there also were everyone was talking throughout about their different stories.
Yes.
And how they realized that they had something, some kind of placement on the autistic spectrum.
Yes, and we divided the submissions up by things that neurologically typical people would find easy to manage. There's a book about early child, or a chapter about early childhood. There's a section on motherhood and on emotion, and so that you can look and see the cluster of pieces under each of these headings and get a sense of a kind of way that we experience the world and the way we experience what other people do with us and around us in the world.
Well, and there were some people that just said they didn't really discover it until very late, and like into the 50s or something.
Yes,
like that.
I'm one of them. Yes, I found out through my son's diagnosis, and it tied everything together for me. It explained things that I hadn't had a way of explaining before. And people sometimes say, well, it's so easy for you to admit to some mental disorder. And my reply is, it's better than believing that you have a character flaw. It really does. It takes away the guilt and the shame that you've borne because you thought that you should have been able to be not the kind of person you are. So.
And actually, though, there's a point of considerable suffering by each person is that they felt somehow they were an elephant person. They were somehow grotesque or eccentric.
Yeah.
And then when they started understanding, there was a logic, a rationale to why this was happening.
Yes.
And it was a processing thing. It wasn't some malicious, or
willful is the word that was used with a lot of us growing up. And it also, once we got there, we moved further to start to experience outrage and start to look at the societal implications of being different-brained, is the way one of the writers talks about it. And we are different-brained, and we live in a culture that approves of a very narrow range of brains. And this creates all kinds of problems for autistic people, men and women, in the workplace, in academia, in marriages, in the criminal justice system. So there's ways in which people whose brains are not like the typical brains that the society values pay a big price for it.
Well, and it seemed as though it's just starting to be understood in a way that the full spectrum of people. They're still, and this point that you made also about women, the difference between men and women, I thought was really interesting. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that, because the frequency of diagnosis was more prevalent for men.
Well, one thing is that if a girl doesn't act like a girl, she's a tomboy. And it's dismissed that way. That's the problem. Or people who are just odd, and so on. But the major problem for women is that we have a society that has enormous social expectations of women. And we are enormously ill-suited to those things because we are asocial. We do not perceive social reality. It matters nothing to us. And that's something that I think people might not understand well, or might see as a kind of aloofness. But what it is that we're personal, we're not antisocial, but there are things in the give and take of the social that elude us. One thing that is in my makeup is that I lack the ability to perceive hierarchies. I cannot perceive what it is I'm supposed to do with someone who is a subordinate or a superior, because they're people. Everybody's people. And those things are like costumes to us. And even things like dressing up. You know, we somehow see all of the social stuff as kind of a performance, because for us it really is. You know, we would as soon not have to perform, and yet we have to kind of perform to make sure that our autistic traits don't seep out and create problems for us. So that's a bittersweet reality.
A friend of mine, and I think you've mentioned this too, talked to me about how what he does is in order to show interest. He has this show interest face.
Yes.
And then sits there and does his show interest face. And he says, I know that it's completely,
Yes.
you know, artificial, but he says, I know that I have to show interest.
Well, one of the interesting things is that how signals are read. Making eye contact, for example, is in this culture critically important. I've had students from other countries say, people don't stare at each other the way you do in America. And it's very hard to get used to people smiling so much. What does everybody go around with a smile on their face for? Well, it's a cultural thing, and we tend to have a flat affect when inside things may be turbulent or richly emotional. But it just doesn't synchronize with outer expression, and that's a big issue. I do a demo in my Composition 2 class when I show a film about schizophrenia, and it's my autistic demonstration, and it goes like this. Person A, I have a bad headache. Person B, oh, my head is killing me. Who has the worst headache? Another thing is, you know, just be spontaneous. Well, who's in charge of what's spontaneous? What is it that you want me to do to be spontaneous? Because if I'm really spontaneous, I might walk out the door. You don't really want that. You want something specific, but you're luring me in with some sort of a sense that I can be okay as myself when clearly it's not okay. And one of the things about the eye contact is that you can teach a child to look at the bridge of the nose, and the other person will believe that they are being looked at. And that creates an interesting issue, because it's not that you have to make eye contact, you have to give the other person the impression that you're making eye contact and the impression of certain things. And there's some really nasty repercussions in the criminal justice system where we say the accused showed no remorse.
Yeah.
Or we say she was a loner, or what are some of the other things that we say about, well, I know a woman who returned to find her house burning down, and right away she started taking an inventory of what was there and what was not, and the expected reaction was sink to your knees and start sobbing, and she didn't do it. She just didn't do it. She fell apart later by the time she'd had a chance to process it. But the insurance company made quite a big deal about the fact that they believed it was self-started, and it took her a while and some investigation to find out that it was a wiring problem. So we expect people to fake things. We expect a fake kind of response, and this makes us a little bit cynical, because we're saying, okay, what do the neurotypicals want from me now? I'm sure it's not what they say they want. I'm sure it's something else. And things get a little disturbing. I've heard of a study that says that when someone says, I'm telling you this secret, don't tell a living soul, that they really want it disseminated in a certain way. And if someone tells me that, it'll go to the grave with me. It'll go to the grave because I take people at their word, and people do not use language to make meaning a good bit of the time.
I want to go back to the title, because One of the evocative elements in the title was it John Gray's book,
Yes, yes.
which almost seems so terribly glib compared to what is in your book. Maybe you can talk a
Yes.
little bit about that.
Well, one of the things that we use that title for is we have a question mark after it because we think we belong right here, thank you very much. But we look at that sort of divide. Women are the feeling ones, men are the detached, practical ones. And we think it's all kind of nonsense. Who are these people and what explains them? And quite often, we can feel particularly marginalized among women's groups where this sense of women are the carers and the nurturers and so on is a doctrine. I stared at my babies when they were little. I just stared at them. They were really interesting. Have they grown up well? Sure they have. They're doing great. So you're really confronted in society by what women are supposed to be and what men are supposed to be, and we are not like either. We look on as people define people in one way or another, and define body language and define gender, and in a very fundamental way, because we are asocial, gender is only somewhat meaningful to us as a concept. We don't have that sense of, I'm a woman and I do woman things and I think woman thoughts, and we're persons, and our gender is almost like a costume as well in our self-identity. We think of ourselves in that way. So I was kind of happy to give a little dig to the Gray book because it is glib and it's categorical. And when we do that, we also allow women who are not different-brained, but who just prefer peace and quiet to socializing, who don't know what to do when the women get together in the kitchen, permission to see that as a social demand and see how heavy-handed the requirements of social behavior are on women.
Well, several of the women in those short essays in the anthology part talked about, they started off from maybe a feminist perspective, but seemed to outgrow it or extend beyond
Yes.
it. That it wasn't adequate to the struggles that they had, which seemed to be far more profound.
Yes, and we also do have that fork in the road when it comes to woman as Earth Mother, woman as sort of the emotional, the person who is sensitive, who would not bring war to the world, and so on. And we look at that and we say, well, why would we be any different than men in that respect? And we're not so darn sure, even if we're feminist in our consciousness, if women's groups would really be comfortable with women who really weren't in that particular mindset about their femaleness.
Maybe this is at the point where we could help the viewers by talking about the universe of autism, because it was quite interesting that there's all these complex, I don't know if you call them positions or elements along the way, and it's not like a progressive, it's just, kind of laid out there as different types.
Yeah, it's sort of clustered, and
Yeah.
I think eventually the knowledge about genes and about brain structure will get to the point where people will have a more exquisite diagnosis. Having diagnoses all chopped up into little boxes seems not to be that useful. It has to be, because clinicians have to have something to work with. But there are autistic people who have very high sensory sensitivities. They have terrible time with noises and with anything, flashing lights, all kinds of sensory sensitivities. Sometimes these autistic books are called Kanner type. Kanner was the person one of the people who sort of stumbled upon autism. And they're seen as distinct from another group who have Asperger syndrome. Asperger and Kanner were contemporaries, one in the States and one in the UK. And it seems as though Asperger had children who were more social and less sensorially sensitive. But even those categories kind of get blurry. If someone becomes able to speak, do they graduate from autism to Asperger syndrome? And then there's another category called high-functioning autism, and it's a little unclear what that is. And so the vocabulary is something we're stuck in, and there probably are quite a variety of expressions of it. I kind of call it my marbles theory. We all have the same number of marbles, but we may have a whole bunch of marbles for autism and a few for ADHD and a few for one thing and another, and then a few for neurologically typical, but we all have the same number, and so the configuration is a matter of ratios really rather than anything else. But many, many conditions are now being kind of grouped together and clustered as on the autism spectrum. You'll hear that word used quite a bit. That's the terminology now. As autistic people organized and part of a community, we choose to set aside the differences among diagnoses and kind of, join forces, and it's not a big deal to us. It's also not a big deal to us to use people first language. I think we are supposed to say, I am someone with autism, as though it's a little thing over here, like I am someone with the flu. It's over here, but we see it as so pervasive and so part of who we are that we are happy to be called autistics, and we see it as that way. I told somebody this once, and she said, "Oh, I've got to be really careful now. I hope I remember that." And I said, "Oh, you don't have to. We do it for our own selves. We're asocial. We don't take offense. We don't know what it means to take offense. So we're just using it as a way of saying this is a way we see ourselves, and we really don't take offense at people's slips of the tongue because we're socially clueless anyway. So it's free
One of the other
pass."
things you point out is that people who have autism also have, what do you call it, comorbidity? In other words,
Yes.
they have other elements
Yes.
of dysfunctionality that...
Yes. I have the hat trick. I have autism, ADHD, and recurrent major depression. And there are various other overlaps. And again, it may be that the explanation for all that will kind of connect. Depression may end up getting fueled from the exasperation and the frustration and the alienation we feel in the social world, where we're not accepted, where we are really put through our paces, and it's very common. But then I tend to think that it's part of the genetic makeup as well, because it's things do kind of occur together. And in families, in my family, I have a first cousin who's a schizophrenic, first cousin who is committed suicide a year ago from severe depression, an uncle who's dyslexic, a second cousin who's ADHD, lots of depression. My sister is highly, highly anxious. She has to speed walk every day to get rid of the adrenaline. And so there's links, expressions of different brainedness in most families where there is autism.
What I thought was interesting is the book doesn't function like those Sprint ads with titles across their forehead. It really is more a sharing of very vibrant personalities and what their struggles are. So I mean, whether
Yes.
they have one kind of type of autism or they have it bundled with other things. It's really their attempts to survive and have meaningful lives and deal with the cards that they have. And as you say, and they say, it's a wiring problem.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
It's just like configuration is just not quite all plugged in the same way, but it's not a lack of intelligence, it's just the
Yeah.
connections.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're up against is quite a strong movement to cure autism. There's an organization called Cure Autism Now, and you will see their ads, and one of the ads says, "Bring these children back." Where are they? They're here. They're right here in front of you. They have things to tell you, but you're filtering that through your own experience. You're not able to sort of imagine how it would be like to have a brain like an autistic brain. And I once did, for a presentation, I did a web search, and I put in autism locked in their own world, and I got 80 hits. And the only reason we lock ourselves in is because society is either oppressing us with noises or what have you, but in general, the door's wide open. The door's wide open, but we don't relate the same way as other people, and that creates problems, I believe, with parents who get an autism diagnosis for their child. And all along they're taking delight in their child. Their child's sort of odd and sort of, as my parents used to say, I was a character. I wasn't an affectionate child. I wasn't rewarding them in that sense, but they found me fascinating to watch my strange behaviors. But then the diagnosticians come heavily down on them, say it's a severe disorder, and there's nothing but gloom ahead, and its pathology is sort of dumped on parents, and it's easy for them to fall into a trap like wanting a cure, when very often all they need is to understand ways of relating to the child, and then they won't feel so alienated or so much a failure as a parent. Listen to their child, and we can tell you how that's done. So,
Thank you for being on Rip Rap.
thank you. I'm glad to have been here.